On this day, the 27th of January, 1944, the Siege of Leningrad is finally lifted after 872 days. It was one of the longest and most destructive sieges in history, costing over about 1.5 million lives and leading to great famine within the city. This was the end of the siege. As part of Operation Barbarossa, the Germans planned on taking Leningrad in the north, as well as Moscow in the middle, and Ukraine in the south. It was meant to be done very quickly, and this would lead to a Soviet collapse or surrender. In the north, the Germans had planned to take Leningrad, firstly because it was the former capital of the Russian Empire, and so this would be a blow to the morale of people within Russia. It was also the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution, so taking this would be a bit of a kick to communism. It was also the base of the Baltic Fleet, and about 11% of all Soviet industrial output in 1939 was in Leningrad. It was an important place, and it needed to be taken. So the plan was the Germans would come from the south, the Finns would come from the north, and together they would surround and strangle the city. Apparently, Adolf Hitler was so confident that he had invitations printed, and these invitations were to be held in the Hotel Astoria in Leningrad after the city was taken. Fortunately for the people of Leningrad, that party never took place. He was also determined to level the city, which is a very strange thing to think about. One of the most beautiful cities in the world, and he's going to level it. So they didn't want to take the city immediately. The whole point was to starve the city out, kill as many people in the city through starvation, and then march in and take an empty city, basically. So that was the plan. However, some problems showed up very quickly. On their march to the city, the Germans had to fight harder than they thought they would. The Finns were very happy to take back the lands that they had lost during the Winter War, but they didn't want anything to do with invading territory that wasn't Finnish. They did a little bit go into Soviet territory, but that was only to straighten the border and make it more defensible. But the Finns never attacked Leningrad. They didn't bomb it, they didn't shell it. They stayed about 40 kilometers north of the city and remained there until 1944, when they were pushed back to Viborg. If the Finns had been more cooperative with the Germans, they probably could have taken Leningrad. As it was, the Finns had their own plans. Mannerheim, the Finnish leader, wasn't an idiot. He had fought and served under the Tsar in the Russian Imperial Army. That's where he became the great marshal that he was. After Finnish independence, he became one of the great men of Finland, and during the Winter War helped defend Finland against Soviet attacks. He wasn't someone who misunderstood Russia or underestimated it. And thankfully for Finland, he didn't get Finland too involved in the Second World War. Finland was a co-belligerent with Germany, but they never joined the Axis. They didn't sign the Tripartite Pact, they didn't sign the Axis or join them. And so at the end of the war, Finland, it lost some territory, but it remained free. There were certain things they had to do. They called it the Finlandization. They had to allow Soviet control over various things like telephones, telephone exchange. They had to be neutral. They couldn't join NATO or the EEC. But they did remain free from Stalin's Soviet Union. So this maneuvering to the north of Leningrad, it was because Mannerheim obviously didn't know if Germany was going to win and didn't want to go all in on his alliance with Germany. Anyway, so that's Finland. The Germans in the south tried their very best to take the city. On August 30th, the last railway into Leningrad was cut by the Germans, and on the 8th they managed to completely cut off all land routes from Lake Ladoga to the Gulf of Finland. And this is where it was going to stay pretty much for the next 2.5 years. There was fighting, there were various offensives. The Soviets did try to break through, but it was unsuccessful until 1944. So, on the 19th of September 1941, that's when we had the worst bombing in Leningrad. Over 1,000 were killed, and almost 300 bombers were involved in this raid. Artillery fire then took over, because the planes are busy elsewhere, and they would launch artillery into the city, and this would kill about almost 6,000 during the war and injure about 20. The Soviets were not going to give up on Leningrad. They evacuated about 1.5 million people, and this was a population of just over 3 million, so about half the population were evacuated. But about 1.5 million died, so that's a lot of people. Many of them were soldiers, so it's estimated that about 1 million civilians died. It still means about 500,000 troops died. That means about 500,000 people were left at the end of the war, end of the siege. It's one of the most costly sieges in terms of life. Probably the costliest, and more people died during the siege of Leningrad than died at Stalingrad, or at Moscow, or at Kursk, or at any other battle. The Soviets had a way to supply Leningrad, and they would use this supply route to bring supplies in and evacuees out. It was over Lake Ladoga, because the Soviets still had access to part of the coast of that lake, and it's a very big lake. It's I don't know, I don't want to say exactly how big it is, but it's probably like half the size of Belgium, or a quarter of the size of Belgium. It's enormous. One of the largest lakes in Europe. And so they had access to a good part of the coast. The Finns had the northern bit and the western bit just above Leningrad. The Germans had a small bit towards the southwest, and the Soviets had the rest. So during the summer they would use boats to get across, and during the winter there was the famous ice road. Once the lake had frozen, they could drive over it with trucks. So it was quite easy to get supplies into St. Petersburg, which is what it is, into Leningrad. However, the Germans would, if they knew what was going on, if they could get them, would launch artillery attacks on the ice road. And many people did die during these operations. During the winter of 1941 into 1942, a great famine gripped the city. There were reports of cannibalism, although there wasn't as much cannibalism as one would think in such a desperate situation. During this time, people would be seen dropping dead in the street. Well, dropping and then dying. So the temptation for cannibalism was there. So the main thing, though, although it wasn't cannibalism, it was murdering people for their ration books. And thousands of people were killed by other Leningraders so they could nick their ration books, because the rations were very low and they'd rather kill someone, take their ration book, than eat that person themselves. This ain't Cultural Revolution China. This is Second World War Leningrad. They didn't have a thirst for human flesh, but they did have a thirst for ration books. So this famine was worst during that first winter. Now in August of 1942, the Soviets and the Germans had planned offences at the same time, so in August. The Germans wanted to finally take the city, and the Soviets wanted to break the siege. They both launched their offensive pretty much at the same time. All of these troops and all this material coming up against each other, and so it ended up being a bit of a farce. And they had to both withdraw, and not much was achieved by either side. So it went back into stalemate. In February of 1943, the Soviets did open a 12-kilometer corridor into Leningrad. But their attempts to break the siege were stopped, actually, by the Spanish Blue Division. The Spanish were outnumbered by 20-1, and yet they fought the Soviets to a standstill. It's something that I've read before, that the Germans were thinking to themselves, if we had 500,000 Spaniards, we'd probably have won this war. Spanish, apparently, very good fighters. And they were in a place that was not naturally their best environment. They're in the middle of a Soviet winter, deep in Russia, not far off the Arctic Circle, probably 12 foot of snow around them, and they pushed a larger, better prepared Soviet force and kept them from their goal. Amazing achievement. But finally, as the war went, so would the siege go. The Germans were being pushed back everywhere. In 1944, one of the largest offensives would see most of the Soviet Union liberated from German occupation. And this would be the same year that Leningrad was finally relieved. 27th of January 1944, the Soviet offensive pushed the Germans away and off back towards Tallinn and the Baltics. Now, during the time when the Germans were occupying the suburbs of St. Petersburg, they looted and vandalized the imperial palaces, which were outside of the city itself. The Catherine Palace, the Peterhof, as well as others. And they carted off quite a lot of loot. One thing that was really interesting was the Amber Room. I think it was in the Catherine Palace. And they took that apart. They had all these amber panels on the wall, and apparently one of the most beautiful things that has ever been created. And it was created apparently in Germany, way back when, and sent out to the Catherine Palace and put up. And the Amber Room was very famous. The Germans took the amber paneling off, carted it somewhere, but it's never been seen again. So no one knows what happened to it. Whether it was destroyed or lost or sunk, we have no idea. But a lot of great art was taken, and some of it lost or destroyed. Some of the palaces were completely ruined. The Peterhof itself had to be rebuilt after the war. So, not only the crime of mass death and indiscriminate killing, but also vandalism and theft as well. But eventually, Leningrad was relieved. Once Leningrad had been relieved and was free once more, the war, in many ways, was almost over. After this great offensive in 1944, it was only going to be a few more months until Russian troops would be marching into Berlin. So for most of the German-Soviet war, Leningrad was under siege. One of the most brutal sieges ever. And this has become kind of legendary in Russia. It is a symbol of Russian defiance of invaders. How dare you come to our great city and attempt to take it? Russian people, even now, are still, rightly so, proud of their resistance in Leningrad. And St. Petersburg has not been destroyed, it was not leveled, and it still stands as one of the great Russian cities of today. If you like these videos, come back for more tomorrow. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment.